The smoke was a ghost clinging to the bones of the house. It coiled around the blackened timbers and rose in a thin, gray sigh against a sky the color of slate. A man, Silas, stopped his horse on the rise overlooking the hollow. He had seen the plume from miles away, a dark finger pointing to a fresh grave. He was a man who knew the language of disaster. He had intended to ride on, to put this valley behind him like all the others. But the silence that followed the smoke was wrong. It was a hungry silence, not the settled quiet of a place left to nature. He nudged his horse forward, the hooves falling soft on the damp earth. He dismounted near the gate, its wood charred, but the hinges still holding. The air was thick with the scent of burnt pine and wet ash. A man's body lay near what was once the porch, covered by a rough woolen blanket. Silas didn't need to lift it. The stillness of the shape beneath told its own story. He looked past the ruin, his eyes scanning the tree line, the outbuildings. Nothing. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement by the old stone well. He walked slowly, his boots making no sound. Huddled against the cold stone were a woman and two small girls, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide and vacant with shock. The woman held them tight, her arms a frail stockade against a world that had just burned down. She looked up as he approached, a flinch of fear in her gaze. She was the resilient survivor, though she did not know it yet. She was just a woman named Alara, and her world was ash. The twin girls, mirrors of each other with their pale hair and dark eyes, pressed closer to her. Silas stopped a few feet away. He carried the weight of a past he never spoke of, and it made him slow to startle and quick to understand. He saw the tremble in her hands, the chapped lips of her daughters. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't ask what happened. The story was written in the scorch marks and the silent form under the blanket. He unstrapped the canteen from his belt and held it out. Elara stared at it, then at him. His face was weathered, his eyes holding a deep and abiding quiet. He was the stoic protector, though he would have denied the title. He was just a man named Silas, passing through. She reached for the water, her fingers brushing his. The touch was like striking a flint in the cold, a spark of life. She gave the water to her girls first, their small hands cupping the metal. She watched him, waiting for the demand, the price. There was always a price. Men like him, loners who appeared from nowhere, they always wanted something. He simply stood there, his gaze moving from the ruin to the barn, the one structure that had been spared the flame's hunger. It was old, leaning, but it was whole. He looked back at her. A tear, thick and slow, finally escaped her control and traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. He saw it, and the stillness in his face tightened. He spoke, his voice rough, unused. "Don't cry." It wasn't a command. It was a plea, the words of a man who had no comfort to offer, only the stark truth that tears wouldn't rebuild a wall or warm a child. He turned and walked toward the barn, his purpose clear. He was not leaving, not yet. Elara watched him go, the canteen still in her hand, the weight of his two words settling in her heart like stones. His silence was a physical thing. It filled the space his body did not. For 2 days, Silas worked. He did not ask for permission. He did not explain his intentions. He moved with the grim economy of a man who builds and mends because it is the only prayer he knows. He started with the dead. He found a shovel with a scorched handle in the rubble of the shed and dug a grave on the hill overlooking the hollow, beneath a solitary oak that had seen 100 seasons. He worked alone, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel, his somber drumbeat against the valley's quiet. Elara watched from the barn doorway, the girls clinging to her dress. She had not asked him to do it, but she knew it had to be done. When he finished, he took the blanket-wrapped body of her husband, Daniel, and carried him to the grave. He did not look at her as he passed. He did not offer a single word. He filled the grave, placed a rough stone at its head, and then he walked back down the hill, his duty done. His work then turned to the living. He focused on the barn, a bulwark against the coming winter. He patched the holes in the roof with salvaged planks, his hammer blows precise and steady. He cleared a large section of the floor, sweeping away the hay and dust of years. He found a rusted but sturdy wood stove in the collapsed workshop, dragged it into the barn, and spent an afternoon cleaning it, checking the flue, making it safe. Every action was deliberate, necessary. He moved like a man whittling a life from a piece of raw, unyielding wood. Elara's fear began to curdle into a tense, wary curiosity. He asked for nothing. When he was thirsty, he drank from the well. When he was hungry, he ate from the small sack of dried meat he carried. He slept in the far corner of the barn, a good distance from them, wrapping himself in his bedroll and facing the door as if standing guard even in his sleep. The girls, Anya and Lena, were less cautious. They would watch him from a distance, their small heads peeking from behind a stack of hay bales. He seemed to notice them, but paid them no direct mind. One afternoon, while he was rehanging the heavy barn door, Lena, the bolder of the two, toddled a few feet closer. "Are you a ghost?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Silas stopped his work. He looked down at the child, his expression unreadable. He considered the question for a long moment. "No," he said, and the single word held no inflection. He went back to his work. Elara pulled Lena back, her heart pounding. But the interaction had changed something. He was not an apparition. He was solid. He was real. That evening, as the first hint of frost sharpened the air, he started a fire in the stove. The small flame pushed back the cavernous gloom of the barn, casting long, dancing shadows. It was the first warmth they had felt in days. He had made a space for them. He had not claimed it. He had not offered it. He had simply built it and then stepped away, leaving the choice to her. Elara gathered her daughters and moved them closer to the stove's gentle heat, a silent acceptance. An unspoken agreement had been forged in the cold, not with words, but with the simple, undeniable act of a shared fire. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, thick blanket, muffling the world in white. It fell without warning, a silent invasion that sealed them inside the barn. The wind howled through the cracks Silas had not yet mended, a mournful sound that spoke of a long, hard winter ahead. For 3 days, they were prisoners of the storm. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. Inside, a small circle of warmth from the wood stove was their entire universe. The close quarters amplified the silence between them. Elara found herself studying Silas, trying to read the story in the lines on his face, in the scars on his knuckles. He spent his time methodically, a man at peace with forced stillness. He sharpened his knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic rasp a strangely comforting sound. He repaired a broken harness he had found, his fingers surprisingly nimble as he stitched the thick leather. He seemed to have no need for conversation. His presence was enough. On the second day, he rose from his spot by the fire and pulled on his heavy coat. Elara watched, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Where are you going?" The question escaped before she could stop it. It was the most she had said to him at once. He paused with his hand on the bar of the door, looking back at her. "Hunting," he said. "The snow makes for good tracking." She wanted to tell him not to go, that the storm was too dangerous. But the words died in her throat. Who was she to tell him what to do? He was not her husband, not her family. He was a stranger who was keeping them alive. He pushed the heavy door open just enough to slip out, and was instantly swallowed by the white chaos. The barn felt colder, emptier in his absence. Elara held the girls close, telling them stories of sunnier days, her voice a thin thread against the wail of the wind. Hours passed. The fear that he would not return began to take root. He could have just walked away. He owed them nothing. The debt was all hers, and it was growing with every log he placed on the fire, every repair he made to their shelter. Then, just as dusk began to bleed through the white, the door creaked open. Silas reappeared, covered in snow, a specter returning from the void. He carried 2 rabbits, their dark fur a stark contrast to the snow clinging to his coat. He closed the door, shaking the cold from his shoulders, and wordlessly set about skinning and cleaning the animals. Later they ate. The smell of roasting meat filled the barn, a rich, life-affirming scent. They sat around the stove, the 3 of them on an old blanket, Silas on an overturned crate. He handed a piece of meat to each of the girls, then to Ilara. It was their first real meal together. Anya, the quieter twin, looked at Silas, her mouth full. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas met her gaze and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He did not smile, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften for a moment. Ilara ate, the warmth of the food spreading through her. It was more than sustenance. It was a communion. In the shared, silent act of eating the food he had provided, a fragile thread of trust was spun. She was still afraid, but a new feeling was beginning to surface alongside the fear. A sliver of gratitude so sharp and profound it almost hurt. She was beginning to understand that his silence was not a sign of coldness, but a kind of honesty. He did not offer words he did not mean. He offered what was real: shelter, warmth, food. He offered survival. The snow stopped on the 4th day, leaving behind a world of pristine, brutal beauty. The sun was a weak disk in a pale sky, its light glinting off the frozen landscape. The quiet was absolute. It was into this quiet that the riders came. There were 3 of them, their horses black shapes moving against the white expanse. They rode with an arrogant slouch, their faces hard and weathered by more than just the cold. Silas was outside, splitting wood, the rhythmic crack of the axe the only sound in the hollow. He saw them long before they reached the burned-out gate. He did not stop his work, but his movements became more deliberate, his body a coiled spring. Ilara saw them too, from the crack in the barn door. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, washed over her. She knew these men. They worked for Barlow, the man who owned most of the valley, the man who had wanted her husband's land. Daniel had refused to sell. He had said the land was not for sale at any price. Then the fire had come. The lead rider, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth named Cale, reined in his horse a few feet from Silas. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "Well now," Cale said, his voice a low sneer. "Look what the storm blew in." He looked past Silas, his eyes fixing on the barn. "Heard there was an accident. Terrible shame about Daniel. He was a stubborn man." Silas didn't answer. He just rested the axe head on the chopping block and stood straight, his gaze steady and flat. He was not a large man, but he possessed a stillness that seemed to take up more space than his physical form. The other 2 men flanked Cale, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Barlow," Cale continued, his eyes flicking back to Silas. "He's concerned for the widow, wants to make sure she's comfortable." The word was an insult. "Who are you?" "Hired hand." Still, Silas said nothing. His silence was a wall. It unnerved them. Men were supposed to talk, to posture, to explain themselves. Silas just watched, his inaction a form of aggression they didn't understand. Cale's sneer tightened. "Barlow sent us to check on his property." "This isn't his property." Alara's voice cut through the cold air. She had stepped out of the barn, her fear eclipsed by a sudden, fierce anger. She stood on the threshold, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. It was Daniel's gun. She didn't know if it was loaded. Cale's eyes widened in mock surprise. a cruel smile playing on his lips. The little widow speaks. Your husband owed Mr. Barlow a considerable sum, Mom. A debt that must be settled. It was a lie. Daniel had owed no one. Get off my land, Ilara said, her voice trembling but firm. Cale laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He looked at Silas. You best advise her, friend. A woman alone, with 2 little girls? This is a hard country. Mr. Barlow is a generous man, but his patience has its limits. He was speaking to Silas, but his threat was aimed squarely at Ilara. Silas shifted his weight slightly. He lifted the axe from the block, his grip casual but firm. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The movement was a sentence in itself. He met Cale's gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something cold and dangerous surfaced in his eyes. It was a look that said he understood violence far better than they did. Cale's smile faltered. He looked at his men, then back at the silent figure with the axe. The odds were 3 to 1, but something about the man's quiet confidence gave him pause. This wasn't some farmhand. This was something else. We'll be back, Cale snarled, pulling his horse's reins. He wheeled the animal around, kicking up a spray of snow. The 3 riders galloped away, their menace lingering in the air like a foul odor. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise. Ilara stood frozen, the shotgun heavy in her arms. Silas did not look at her. He turned back to the chopping block and swung the axe, splitting a log with a clean, sharp crack that echoed the breaking of the hollow's fragile piece. The rider's visit left a poison in the air. The unspoken truce between Silas and Ilara, born of necessity, now sharpened into a silent, grim alliance. They both knew the men would return. The fire had not been an accident, and Barlow's greed had not been sated. It was a truth that settled between them, heavy and cold as the winter ground. Without a word exchanged, their work took on a new urgency. They were no longer just surviving. They were fortifying. Silas's labor became a relentless campaign against the vulnerability of their shelter. He worked from dawn until the last light failed, his movements precise and tireless. He used the charred timbers from the ruined house, salvaging any wood that was still sound. With these blackened beams, he began to build a fence. It wasn't a fence to keep cattle in, but to keep men out. It was a crude stockade, rising from the snow-covered earth around the barn, a dark and defiant perimeter. The work was brutal. The frozen ground fought the shovel, and the heavy logs resisted his efforts. But he did not stop. Ilara, shedding the last of her passive grief, began to work alongside him. She could not lift the heavy timbers, but she could drag smaller pieces of wood, clear away debris, and bring him hot water from the stove to thaw his frozen hands. They worked in tandem, a rhythm developing between them. He would set a post, and she would be there with the next one. He would measure a length of board, and she would have the nails ready. Their shared labor became a conversation. Each swing of his hammer was a declaration of intent. Each piece of wood she carried was an affirmation. They were building more than a fence. They were building a shared resolve. In the evenings, the barn was filled with a different kind of industry. While Ilara mended the girls' thin dresses, stitching patches over patches, Silas would sit by the fire and carve. He had found a block of seasoned pine, and with his sharp knife, he began to coax shapes from the wood. The girls would watch, mesmerized, as a small, rough form began to emerge. It was a bird, its wings half spread, as if about to take flight. The act was one of quiet creation in a world that had seen so much destruction. It was a small, profound act of hope. One evening, as he worked on the carving, Anya crept closer. She sat on the floor beside him, watching the blade shave away thin curls of wood. She didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly she asked, "Is that for me?" Silas paused, his knife still. He looked at the half-finished bird in his hand, then at the girl's expectant face. He seemed to consider it, as if the thought had not occurred to him. No, he said, his voice low. This one is for your sister. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another, identical block of wood. Yours isn't finished yet. A rare, fleeting smile touched Anya's lips before she scurried back to her mother. Alara watched the exchange, a warmth spreading in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. This silent, guarded man was not just a protector. He was building a fortress of wood and nails, but he was also tending to the small, fragile hopes of her children. He was carving a space for them in this harsh world, not just with fences, but with the promise of a small wooden bird. The fence grew higher, and the nights grew colder, and the unspoken bond between the man, the woman, and the two small girls grew stronger, forged in the shared labor of defiance. A blizzard descended upon them, more ferocious than the first. It came with a shrieking wind that clawed at the barn and piled snow in great drifts against the new fence. For 4 days, the world outside ceased to exist. They were entombed in a howling white wilderness, the barn a tiny, fragile ark in a sea of snow. The forced confinement pressed in on them, shrinking their world to the small circle of firelight. The silence, once a space for caution and observation, now felt charged with unspoken histories. The nights were the worst. The wind sounded like a living thing, a hungry beast trying to tear its way in. On the second night, Lena developed a fever. She tossed and turned on their makeshift bed of hay and blankets, her skin hot to the touch, her breath coming in shallow rasps. Alara was consumed by a quiet, desperate panic. She bathed the girl's forehead with a cloth dipped in melted snow, her heart aching with a sense of helpless isolation. There was no doctor, no medicine, only the meager remedies she could devise. Silas watched from his corner. He saw the fear in Alara's eyes, the taut line of her shoulders. He got up and stoked the fire, adding logs until the stove glowed with heat, pushing back the encroaching chill. He then took a small tin from his saddlebag, something Alara had never seen before. He opened it. Inside was a dried, fragrant herb. Willow bark, he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's cry. Chew a little. It will help the fever. He held it out to Alara. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. She gave a small piece to Lena, coaxing the child to chew the bitter bark. For the rest of the night, Alara sat with her daughter, holding her, whispering to her. Silas did not go back to his bedroll. He sat on the crate across the fire, cleaning his rifle, the methodical click and scrape of metal on metal, a steady, reassuring presence in the dim light. The storm raged. The child whimpered. The man and woman kept their silent vigil. In the deep, quiet hours before dawn, with Lena's breathing finally evening out into a less troubled sleep, Alara spoke into the gloom. Thank you. Silas looked up from his work, his face half hidden in shadow. He simply nodded. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind and a crackle of the fire. I had a daughter once, Silas said, his voice so quiet Alara wasn't sure she had heard it right. He wasn't looking at her, but at the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. And a wife, the fever took them, the same kind. The admission hung in the air, a stunning, painful revelation. It explained so much, the quiet confidence, the deep well of sorrow in his eyes, the reason he was wandering alone through a world that had taken everything from him. He had not just lost a family. He was a ghost haunted by the memory of one. Alara felt a profound and aching empathy for this man. His pain was a mirror to her own grief. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head slightly, as if to dismiss her sympathy, or perhaps the memory itself. It was a long time ago. He said no more, and Alara did not press. But the shared confidence, a brief and stark confession in the heart of a blizzard, had irrevocably altered the space between them. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a man who understood loss. He was a man who knew what it was to have his world burned down around him, whether by fire or by fever. He was, she realized, just like her. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world transformed, draped in a thick mantle of white. The sun returned, sharp and bright, and with it came the slow, inexorable thaw. Icicles hanging from the eaves of the barn began to weep, their tears tracing dark lines down the weathered wood. The world was stirring from its frozen slumber, and with it, something was thawing between the inhabitants of the barn. The grim necessity of winter survival slowly gave way to the quiet rhythm of a shared life. The days fell into a pattern. Silas would work on the fence or hunt, his presence a steady anchor in their precarious existence. Elara would manage their small household, her hands rediscovering the purpose of domestic tasks. She stretched their meager supplies, cooked their meals, and mended their clothes with a fierce, protective focus. Her work was its own form of fortification, building a home within the rough walls of the barn. The girls, no longer afraid of the silent man, became his small shadows. They would follow him as he worked, their chatter a bright counterpoint to his quiet. He never initiated conversation with them, but he would answer their endless questions with a grave, simple patience. He taught them how to identify animal tracks in the snow, the delicate V of a bird, the deeper print of a deer. He showed them which branches made the best kindling. He was teaching them to see the world as he did, as a book of signs, a place of danger, but also of provision. One afternoon, Elara found him sitting on a stump, the half-finished wooden birds in his hand. He was sanding them with a piece of rough stone, his movements gentle and precise. Lena and Anya sat at his feet, watching in rapt silence. He had carved two distinct birds, one with its head turned to the left, one to the right, so they could tell them apart. He was not just making them toys. He was acknowledging them as individuals. The sight caused a strange flutter in Elara's chest. This man, who spoke so little, communicated in a language of profound, thoughtful action. Her care for him began to show in small, unspoken ways. She started setting aside the best piece of meat for him. When she mended the girl's clothes, she would also check his coat for loose seams or tears, repairing them while he slept. One evening, he fell asleep on the crate by the fire, exhausted from a long day of reinforcing the northern wall of the fence. His head was slumped to his chest, the harsh lines of his face softened in slumber. For the first time, he looked not like a protector, but like a man who needed protecting. He looked vulnerable. Elara quietly took the spare blanket, the warmer of the two, and draped it over his shoulders. He stirred, but didn't wake. She stood for a moment, watching the firelight play over his sleeping face. In that quiet moment, she acknowledged the truth that had been growing in her heart. He was no longer a stranger she depended on. He had become a part of the small, broken family that was reforming in the ashes of her old life. The fence was nearly complete. The snow was receding, revealing patches of damp, dark earth. Spring was coming. But with the thaw came the chilling certainty that their fragile peace was temporary. The world was waking up, and with it, the greed of men like Barlow. The melting snow felt less like a promise and more like a countdown. The thaw brought him. Just as the last of the snow was melting into muddy rivulets, Barlow himself rode into the hollow. He was not like his men. He was dressed in a fine wool coat and rode a handsome gray gelding, the very picture of wealth and authority. But beneath the civilized veneer, his eyes were cold and possessive. He brought two of his thugs with him, including Cale, but they hung back as he dismounted at the new, formidable gate. Silas was there to meet him, standing just inside the perimeter he had built. He held no axe this time, just himself, his hands empty at his sides. Barlow surveyed the crude but effective fence, a look of annoyed surprise on his face. "Quite the little fortress you've built," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. He looked at Silas. "I've come to speak with the widow." "Let me in." Silas didn't move. He just stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle. Barlow's smile was thin. I see. The loyal watchdog. I'll remember your dedication when this land is mine. Now stand aside. From the barn door, Elara spoke, her voice clear and steady. He doesn't take orders from you. Neither do I. Barlow turned, his gaze falling upon her. He gave a small, courtly bow that was more of a mockery than a sign of respect. Ah, Mrs. Danielson, my deepest condolences on your loss. I've come to help you in your time of need. We don't need your help, Elara said, stepping forward. The girls watched from the doorway behind her, their faces pale. On the contrary, Barlow said, his tone turning sharp. You are a woman alone, with children, on a piece of land you cannot possibly manage. Your husband was in debt, a fact we can discuss privately. I am prepared to be generous. I will buy this land from you, settle the debt, and give you enough to start a new life somewhere else. $100. The amount was an insult, barely enough to buy a train ticket out of the state, let alone start a new life. It was the price of a good horse. The land is not for sale, Elara said, and my husband had no debts with you. Barlow's facade of civility cracked. His face hardened. Danielson was a fool. He stood in the way of progress. This valley is going to have a railroad coming through it, and this plot is essential. I will have this land, one way or another. My offer is more than fair. It is a charity. He looked from her to Silas, his eyes filled with contempt. Do not be swayed by this drifter. What can he offer you? A winter in a barn? I am offering you a future. We have a future, Elara said, her chin high. She glanced at Silas, a flicker of an unspoken message passing between them. We. The word hung in the air. A declaration. Barlow saw it. He saw the silent man who stood like a rock, the defiant woman, the fence they had built together. He saw not a victim in a hired hand, but a united front. His face contorted in a brief flash of rage. You will regret this, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Both of you. This land will be mine by spring planting. I promise you that. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, his men following like jackals behind him. The air was still and cold after he left, but the threat he had delivered was a living thing, a promise of violence that now lay over the homestead like a shroud. The time for building was over. The time for fighting was coming. The aftermath of Barlow's visit was a heavy, oppressive silence. The sun felt colder. The budding leaves on the trees seemed to mock their fragile situation. They both knew his threat was not idle. He would not come back to talk again. The next time, he would come to take. The unspoken alliance forged through winter now became a grim pact for the coming battle. The work changed. Silas no longer built. He prepared. He spent an entire day cleaning and oiling his rifle, a long-barreled Winchester. The movements were practiced, efficient, the actions of a man who had done this many times before. He checked his limited supply of ammunition, laying the brass cartridges out in neat rows on a blanket. There were not many. Each one would have to count. Elara watched him, her stomach a tight knot of fear. This was the reality of their defiance. It would be paid for in blood. That evening, after the girls were asleep, he brought the rifle to her. He held it out. You need to know how this works. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a teacher instructing a student in a harsh, necessary lesson. She took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, cold and solid. It felt like an instrument of death. I've never. She started, her voice a whisper. I know, he said. He stood behind her, his presence close but not touching. He guided her hands, showing her how to work the lever action, how to load the cartridges into the gate, how to sight down the barrel. His instructions were simple, direct. It kicks hard. Hold it firm against your shoulder. Don't close your eyes. Squeeze the trigger Don't pull it. The lesson was stark and terrible. It was an admission that he might not be enough, that she too might have to fight. When she understood the mechanics, he took the rifle back and handed her Daniel's old shotgun. "This will be yours," he said. "It's for close work. You stay in the barn with the girls. You don't come out. You don't open the door for anyone but me. If they get through the door, you use this." He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze intense. "You keep the girls safe, no matter what." She nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his words, of the shotgun in her hands, was immense. Later that night, she saw him by the firelight, the two small wooden birds in his hands. He was putting the finishing touches on them, smoothing the last rough edges. He had carved Anya's name on the wing of one, Lena's on the other. It was an act of such profound tenderness in the face of such impending violence that it made Ilara's heart ache. He was preparing for a fight to the death, and he was taking the time to finish a gift for two little girls he had met only a few months ago. He was not just a protector. He was a father in all the ways that mattered. The next day, he finished his preparations. He reinforced the barn door, bracing it with a heavy timber. He set up positions, places of cover behind the woodpile and the stone well. He was turning their home into a battlefield. As dusk fell, a strange calm settled over the hollow. The birds sang their evening songs. A gentle breeze rustled the new leaves. It was a perfect spring evening, beautiful and serene, a stark contrast to the ugliness they knew was coming. Silas stood by the fence, watching the road, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Ilara stood in the barn doorway, the shotgun cold in her hands. Their eyes met across the yard. No words were needed. They were ready. The attack came after the moon had set, in the deep, starless dark that precedes the dawn. A sudden flicker of orange against the far side of the barn was the first warning. Fire. They were trying to burn them out, just as they had before. Silas moved instantly, not with panic, but with a lethal grace. "Inside," he commanded Ilara, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door." She herded the terrified, half-asleep girls into the deepest corner of the barn, and dropped the heavy timber into place, sealing them in. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She checked the shotgun, her fingers finding the cold metal of the shells. She would not fail him. She would not fail her daughters. Outside, the night exploded into chaos. The crack of a pistol shot split the air, followed by the deeper boom of Silas's Winchester. He was not in the barn. He had anticipated their tactics. He was out there, in the darkness, a ghost in his own fortress. Ilara could only listen, her imagination painting a horrific picture with every sound. She heard men shouting, their voices raw with anger and surprise. They had expected to be fighting a cornered animal, not a seasoned hunter who had turned the tables on them. Another shot from the Winchester, followed by a scream of pain that was cut short. The smell of smoke was stronger now, but it was mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder. The girls were crying, huddled behind her. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice a lie she desperately wanted to believe. "It's all right. Stay with me." The attackers, realizing Silas was not where they thought he was, changed their focus. A heavy blow struck the barn door, making the wood shudder. Then another. They were trying to break their way in. Ilara raised the shotgun, its twin barrels pointing at the door. Her breath hitched. "Stay behind me," she told the girls. The door groaned, a hinge screaming in protest. A splintered hole appeared, and then a man's face, contorted in a vicious grin. It was Cale. He saw her, and his grin widened. "Nowhere left to run, widow." He raised his pistol. The world slowed down. Ilara saw his finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the flash of firelight on the barrel of her own gun. She remembered Silas's words, "Squeeze, don't pull." She squeezed. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder with brutal force, the roar of it deafening in the enclosed space. Cale's face disappeared from the hole in a spray of red. The recoil sent her stumbling back, but she did not fall. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then, from outside, came a rapid succession of shots. 2 from a pistol, 1 from the Winchester. A final gurgling cry, and then nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, which seemed to be dying down. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Alara stood with the smoking shotgun, her ears ringing, her body trembling. The girls were silent behind her, their eyes wide with terror. "Silas?" She called out, her voice cracking. No answer. "Silas!" She screamed, a raw knot of fear in her throat. The bar on the door was lifted from the outside. The door creaked open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the first gray light of dawn. His face was grim, his shirt dark with blood on one side. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, but he was alive. He looked past her, to the girls. "It's over," he said, his voice strained. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the floor of the barn. The sun rose on a scene of carnage. The bodies of Barlow and his men lay where they had fallen, stark and still in the cool morning light. The fire they had set against the barn had been small, a distraction, and it had already guttered out, leaving a black scar on the wall Silas had so carefully reinforced. The battle was over, but a new one was just beginning. Alara knelt by Silas's side, her hands shaking as she tore away the fabric of his blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had gone through his side, a clean wound, but he had lost a lot of blood. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The stoic protector, the immovable man, was now helpless, his life in her hands. The role reversal was swift and absolute. She was no longer the one being saved. She was the savior. A fierce, determined calm settled over her. She would not let him die. She sent Anya, her face streaked with tears, to fetch the cleanest water from the well. She instructed Lena to bring her the mending kit, the one with the strongest thread and needles. The girls, seeing their mother's resolve, obeyed without question, their fear giving way to a sense of purpose. She cleaned the wound as he had taught her to treat animal bites, with a gentle, steady hand. He was conscious, his eyes watching her, filled with a mixture of pain and a raw, unguarded trust. She worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed, her fear channeled into a meticulous precision. She disinfected the wound with the last of their whiskey, earning a sharp hiss of pain from him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he rasped, his voice weak. "It's good." The most difficult part was stitching the wound closed. Her fingers, accustomed to mending dresses and dolls, now had to mend human flesh. She took a deep breath, threaded the needle, and began. Each stitch was a prayer. Each pull of the thread was a promise. He did not cry out, but she could see the pain etched on his face, the tightening of his jaw. When she was finished, she bandaged him with strips of clean linen from one of her old chemises. She covered him with every blanket they owned and propped his head up on a sack of feed. She then went outside, the shotgun still in her hand, and faced the grim task of what came next. The law, in the form of a lone, weary sheriff, arrived 2 days later, drawn by a neighbor who had heard the gunfire. He found Alara sitting on the porch of the barn, the shotgun across her lap, watching over a sleeping Silas. The bodies were still there. She told him the story, her voice flat and even, leaving nothing out. The sheriff listened, his eyes taking in the fence, the burned house, the bodies of men known for their cruelty, and the wounded man being cared for by the widow he was supposed to have terrorized. He looked at Barlow's cold, dead face. He knew this man's reputation. He knew of his greed. He looked at the 2 little girls peeking from the barn door, their eyes large and frightened. The sheriff made his decision. He declared it a clear case of self-defense and claim jumping. He organized a wagon to remove the bodies and asked no difficult questions about the quiet man with the rifle. The law for once was on the side of the just. For weeks, Alara nursed Silas back to health. She fed him broth, changed his bandages, and kept a vigil by his side. In his weakness, a new intimacy grew between them. The silence was no longer one of caution, but of deep, shared understanding. He was hers to protect now, and in protecting him, she found the last missing piece of her own strength. The healing of his body mirrored the healing of their small, broken family. Spring arrived in earnest. The bleak, scarred landscape of the hollow yielded to a profusion of green. Wild flowers bloomed on the hill where Daniel lay buried, and the air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and new life. The violence of that terrible night began to feel like a distant, bad dream, its memory fading with the last of the winter chill. The fence Silas had built stood strong, no longer a fortification against attack, but a simple boundary marking the edges of their home. A new home was rising from the ashes of the old. With wood from the forest and stones from the creek, Silas, now healed and steady on his feet, began to build a small, sturdy cabin on the foundation of the burned-out house. Alara worked beside him, her hands now strong and capable. The girls, their laughter once again filling the valley, helped in their own small ways, carrying kindling or bringing them cool water from the well. The rhythm of their life was one of creation. The sound of the hammer and saw replaced the echo of gunfire. The shared work was a balm, a way of rebuilding, not just a structure, but a life. The found family, forged in fire and tempered in blood, was now setting down roots. Silas was different. The deep, abiding sadness in his eyes had not vanished, but it was now tempered with a quiet contentment. He still spoke little, but his silences were comfortable, filled with an easy companionship. He smiled now, small, rare smiles that were reserved for the girls. He finished the 2 wooden birds and gave them to Anya and Lena, who cherished them as their greatest treasures. He was teaching them how to plant a garden, showing them how to press the tiny seeds into the rich soil. He was no longer a drifter, a ghost passing through. He was a man who was planting. One evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley, Alara stood on the half-finished porch of their new cabin. She watched Silas in the garden with the girls, his dark head bent close to theirs as he explained something about the earth. He looked up and saw her watching. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a whole conversation passed between them. It spoke of gratitude, of shared loss, and of the incredible, unexpected solace they had found in each other. He was not Daniel. She was not the wife he had lost. They were 2 broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to become whole again, together. The past was a part of them, a landscape of scars they would always carry, but it no longer defined them. Their future was here, in this small cabin, in this peaceful valley, with the sound of children's laughter and the promise of a harvest. The stoic protector had found a home. The resilient survivor had found her peace. And the 2 little girls had found a father. So here ends our story of a family born not of blood, but of circumstance. A testament to the idea that home is not always a place you are given, but a place you can build, even in the ashes. It proves that the deepest bonds are often forged in the harshest fires, and that sometimes the most profound love is the one that is never spoken aloud, but is demonstrated every day in the simple, steady act of staying. Before you go, tell me, have you ever seen a love so quiet, yet so strong, that it could rebuild a world?